You may think financial advice is just about saving more. What if your biggest mistake in retirement isn't spending too much, it's being afraid to spend at all? Let's chat. My name is Gina DiGirolamo. I'm here today with Matt Mondoux. Matt, I'm excited for our conversation today. Thanks for joining me.
As always, yeah. Let's get into it.
Absolutely. So like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about how to encourage retirees to have confidence in their spending as they approach that new phase of life. So as you know, we'll sometimes get asked, what's the number? How much do I need to retire? Why is that not always the right question?
Well, it's such a good question in many regards, right? And oftentimes, here we take a detailed look at cash flow. So we're trying to match expenses with the amount that a retiree or a potential retiree saved. But what can happen is that, often people will accumulate more wealth than they're able to spend. So their spending might be less than what could be optimal or optimized for the amount of assets that they've saved up. And I think that's human nature. I think people tend to think that they're going to live maybe some reduced lifestyle. You need a little bit less. You're not driving to work, buying work clothes, maybe not going out to as many lunches, those kind of things. And perhaps they're sacrificing the potential to travel more, engage in more hobbies, do more things than they think would be possible.
So let's say you're talking to a couple who's mid to late 50s, they're gearing up to retire in their early 60s. They have had careers at full speed, they've had this working life, and now time becomes a really big asset. How do you encourage someone to use that time wisely and use the wealth that they've built up on valuable experiences?
Yeah, so I think, there's a couple things, so we can encourage through our words as much as we want. I think a lot of times we want to prove it to a client through cash flow planning, through financial planning. So it's really getting them to think about what would be an appropriate vacation budget. So if we just have a line item expense, general expenses, living expenses on a cash flow statement, how can we break that down further and perhaps add a separate line item for trips, for vacations, for hobbies, for different things that they want to do in retirement, they're just not sure. So again, encouragement's great. A lot of times we do want to encourage clients, but what's one step better is actually showing them it's possible and that there can be money left over if that's a goal, if inheritance is a goal, if charitable giving is a goal at the end of life, showing them that both things can be achieved through a well thought out financial plan.
Yep, that's awesome. So if someone might be apprehensive to that, right? You've saved and you've kind of had this moving target in your mind of this is the day I retire. And I think it's so common to just have that goal, but not think about what happens after that last day of work. Yeah. So how do you help the mindset shift, not only from a cash flow perspective, but just, that's a big change for someone.
Yeah, I think a lot of people head into retirement and think of it as an event, but it's really a stage of life. Odds are you're going to be retired for decades. So there is a long-term aspect of retirement. I think people really need to reframe that. Like, this isn't just an event. This is something that you're going to head into. And I think the more that people can think about their retirement as opposed to kind of like, hey, I'm escaping work, but really I'm running to this next phase of life. And what does that mean for me? What does that mean for hobbies, travel? What am I going to do with my time? How am I going to feel fulfilled in retirement, as opposed to, hey, this is just kind of the next thing. I'm in my early 60s and I just don't want to work anymore. I want to be done. I can't stand my job. How can you think about this to be a more fulfilling stage of life?
So you mentioned retirement is a journey. It's not just one day, right? There's multiple stages, and what we often see is that people might delay spending early in retirement to save for this down the road potential expense. How do you help people and kind of coach them through spreading out their spending over the course of their retirement?
Yeah, so there's a few ways. I think like in a simplistic sense, we really can monitor spending relative to portfolio size by way of just looking at distribution rates from the portfolio. So if you take out, $10,000 in your portfolio is worth $100,000, or you take out $100,000 and your portfolio is worth $1 million, both of those are 10% distribution rates. Now, if your portfolio is worth $1 million and you take out $5,000, that is likely really, really, relatively speaking, very small relative to the portfolio balance. And you can kind of extrapolate that based on larger balances, larger spending. So we can really tell over time if somebody's taking out less than what they could just by way of a distribution percentage. That's a really simplistic kind of rule of thumb, not an exact science. The other way, again, is through, we keep coming back to comprehensive financial planning, looking at multi-decade cash flow statements. We can run those at, I would say pessimistic rates of return or market return assumptions, and figure out, okay, at the end of this, if this all plays out the way that we're planning it to play out, what's left at the end? Because we do recognize that somebody, sitting on their proverbial deathbed, taking their last breath, opening up their last financial brokerage statement and saying, wow, I have $15 million in my account. And that's, at age 90, how much did they forego to achieve that? And was that their optimal result? Maybe it was for some people, but it's certainly not for everybody.
Yeah. Let's kind of flip the script and talk about people that are maybe more in the accumulation phase of their life and thinking about their retirement and that magic number that they want to have on the day that they retire. Would you ever, or have you encouraged someone maybe to save less, knowing what their spending is, or to always save more? What does that look like in the accumulation phase?
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because more is always better than less, but that's not always the right answer. We do look at how people are saving, right? So there is a lot of, I would say, diligence done around saving too much in pre-tax assets. And that gets into a whole separate topic of tax planning and retirement, pre-retirement, post-retirement. But that can be a very real thing where we make active recommendations to change the nature of some of that retirement saving.
Yeah.
That's a big one. Certainly, I think people should be aware of that they're not necessarily aware of. But I will say, for people who are maybe a decade or two away from retirement, I think of home purchase. So some people may think that they're not totally sure they can afford a home, one home versus another. I think that that's kind of one of those lifestyle things we can really talk about and try to plan for. And maybe we can encourage someone to buy a bigger house that they might think that they can afford, kind of based on where their trajectory is going, that they may not be aware of.
Yeah. And the comprehensive planning and understanding each piece of it, not just cash flow or not just investment performance, but the looking at it from a tax lens and a retirement lens and all of these different areas is very, very important.
Yeah.
So if you were to give a piece of advice or one key thing for someone approaching retirement and they're thinking about their lifestyle and how they can enter into this new phase, what would that be?
Yeah, I think you want to hit the ground running. So I would say pre-retirement, really think about what you want to do. In that could be like leisure activities, right? Vacations. Do you want to take the grandkids on a trip? Do you want to take the whole family on a trip? Is that going to be a goal of yours to take your family on a trip, enjoy wealth with them if they're going to get it anyways when you pass away? The other thing I always think about too is, to the extent you have any home projects you might want to knock out, big ticket items, it feels a lot better to do some of those bigger ticket items while you're working, while cash flow is coming in. So I like to encourage people to do those things too, kind of pre-retirement. I think it's a nice kind of segue into retirement, having those things checked off your list.
For someone that might be apprehensive to spend in retirement, what is the opportunity cost by doing that?
Yeah, it can be significant, right? So nobody knows what the next card in the deck is health-wise, right? But there can be certain experiential trips, let's take the vacation example. There can be certain experiential trips that you might not get the same value out of should you wait. So if you want to hike, if you want to go to Europe and hike, you're probably going to be more likely to do that if you're in good health at 65 than if you're at 75. Another great example would be if a goal of yours was to take your grandkids to Disneyland, and they're currently 5 and 7. If you wait 10 years, are you going to get the same experience when they're 15 and 17 versus the magic of Disney World at 5 and 7? Mm-hmm. So I think that those are the things that people really want to think about, and that's where we really want to encourage people to do these things while they can, because nobody knows what the next card in the deck is, and those types of experiences have tremendously more value earlier than delaying them another 10 years till this retiree comes up with that theoretical number that they had in their head, at which point they would decide they had too much money.
Yeah.
So how do we give people permission to do it now, as opposed to them waiting for something down the road that may never materialize?
I think it's all about encouraging people that their portfolio is more than just a number. It's about the life that you want to build for yourself and the lifestyle that you want to have.
Yeah, and that's kind of our role as financial planners, consultants in this experience, right? It's like running a marathon. I would never encourage you sprint out at the beginning of a marathon either. So we don't want to necessarily overspend, but we also don't want to get to the end of the marathon and we're the last 100 yards and we save so much energy because we walked that we can sprint across the finish line. Mm-hmm. We want to find some happy medium. And that's really what the goal, I think, of financial planning is for retirement.
And having a partnership with an advisor is very important to bounce those ideas off of and create that bucket list to make sure that they get done, because a lot of times we've seen people procrastinate or push it off or say maybe one day, but a lot of times we can give you the confidence to do it now.
Yeah, and we always use the GPS analogy.
Yeah.
We're heading on a trip in the GPS, and that's what the financial plan is, and we're going to constantly reroute as circumstances change. So financial planning isn't just a one-time thing that gets put in a binder that says you can retire and you put it away. This is a really iterative process that occurs, sometimes multiple times a year, but at least every year, where we're reviewing, okay, where are we at? How did the markets help us advance our retirement? How much did we spend? Did we do a little more than we thought? Did we do less? What are we going to plan for next year? Those types of things, I think financial planning has a tremendous amount of value.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thanks, Matt.
No problem. Thank you.
Absolutely. And can't wait to chat again soon.